Epictetus was born around the year 55 in the city of Hierapolis, a small town in what is now Turkey. At that time, the Roman Empire was at its height, and the land was ruled by emperors who owned large estates and many slaves. Epictetus began his life as a slave in the household of a wealthy Roman named Epaphroditus. The name Epictetus means acquired or possessed, a reminder that his early years were spent under the control of another person. His master, Epaphroditus, worked as a secretary for the Emperor Nero. In the Roman world, a slave could be bought, sold, or freed. Epictetus learned to read and write while he served his master. He also listened to the teachings of the philosopher Musonius Rufus, who visited the house to give lectures. Musonius taught that the good life is found in living according to reason and in caring for others. Epictetus absorbed these ideas while he was still a slave, and they would shape his later work. When Epaphroditus died, the law allowed his slaves to be freed. Epictetus gained his freedom in his early 30s. The moment he stood on his own feet, he felt a deep sense of relief. He could now speak openly about philosophy without fear of punishment. Freedom also gave him the chance to travel to Rome, the capital of the empire, where he began to teach. In Rome, Epictetus opened a school of philosophy. He taught in a public place called Stoa, a covered walkway where people could gather. The school attracted many students, including wealthy Romans and soldiers. One of his most famous students was the future emperor Marcus Aurelius, who later wrote his own reflections on philosophy. The school was simple. Epictetus would sit on a low bench, speak in plain language, and ask his listeners to think about how they could live better lives. He never wrote a book himself. His teachings were recorded by his student Arrian, who compiled them into the Discourses and the Enchiridion, a short handbook. A story from his time in Rome tells how the Emperor Hadrian visited the school. Hadrian was known for his interest in philosophy and the arts. He entered the Stoa and listened as Epictetus explained that a person should not be upset by external events, only by the judgments they make about those events. Hadrian was impressed and praised the teacher, saying that his words were like a clear mirror that showed the truth. This meeting gave Epictetus a reputation that spread throughout the empire. Another anecdote comes from the day Epictetus learned of his master's death. The news arrived while he was teaching. Some of his students expected him to mourn loudly, as was the custom for a former master. Instead, Epictetus calmly said that the death of a slave's master is an external event that does not affect the inner freedom of the soul. He used the moment to illustrate that grief should be based on what is truly in our control, not on things that happen outside us. This calm response left a strong impression on those who heard him. Epictetus lived during a time when other philosophers were also shaping the ideas of the empire. Seneca, a Roman statesman and writer, taught that virtue is the only good, and that wealth is indifferent. Marcus Aurelius, who would later become emperor, kept a personal journal that reflects Stoic ideas similar to those of Epictetus. Musonius Rufus, his early teacher, emphasized that philosophy should be lived, not just talked about. These thinkers shared a common belief that reason and self-control lead to a good life. The core of Epictetus' teaching can be summed up in a few simple points. First, there are things that are up to us, such as our thoughts, desires, and actions. Second, there are things that are not up to us, such as other people's opinions, the weather, or the actions of the government. Third, the key to peace is to focus on what is up to us and to accept what is not. He often used the image of a farmer who tends his field. The farmer cannot control whether rain comes, but he can control how he prepares the soil and plants the seeds. In the same way, a person can control how they think about a loss, even if they cannot control the loss itself. To bring the ideas into everyday life, imagine a student who works with a strict coach. The coach pushes the student hard, corrects every mistake, and demands discipline. The student may feel angry or frustrated at the coach's harsh tone. Epictetus would say that the coach's behavior is outside the student's control. What the student can control is how they respond. They can choose to see the coach's criticism as a chance to improve, or they can let it ruin their confidence. By focusing on their own effort, the student follows the Stoic path. Another everyday example is a person who loses a job. The loss of income, the disappointment, and the uncertainty are all events that happen outside the person's direct control. The person can either sink into despair or use the situation as a chance to explore new skills, to reflect on what truly matters, and to plan a different path. The Stoic view holds that the reaction, not the event, determines the level of peace. This example shows how Epictetus' ideas can help modern people handle stress. Real-world applications of his teachings appear in modern therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, uses a method similar to Epictetus's advice. It asks patients to examine the thoughts that cause distress and to replace them with more realistic judgments. When a therapist tells a client, "It is not the event that hurts you, but the belief you have about the event," the language echoes the ancient teacher. Many people who practice mindfulness also recall the Stoic practice of observing thoughts without judgment. Modern interpretations of Epictetus often appear in self-help books and podcasts. Some writers claim that his ideas are a practical guide for living in a fast-paced world. Others argue that the ancient context of slavery and empire makes his teachings less relevant today. This debate leads to two main counterarguments. The first counterargument questions whether Epictetus' background as a former slave limits the universality of his ideas. Critics say that because he lived under a system that denied him many rights, his focus on inner freedom might ignore the importance of external justice. They argue that a person who cannot change their social conditions may find his advice to accept what is not up to you as a way to stay passive. In this view, the philosopher's personal experience of being owned could make him overemphasize personal calm at the expense of social action. The second counterargument challenges the impact of his teacher's influence on his thought. Some scholars note that Musonius Rufus, who taught Epictetus, already held many of the same ideas about virtue and self-control. They suggest that Epictetus may have simply repeated his teacher's views rather than creating a new system. This line of thinking implies that the fame of Epictetus rests more on the way his student Arrian recorded his words than on any original insight. Supporters of Epictetus respond to these critiques by pointing to the way he applied his ideas in public life. When he met Emperor Hadrian, he did not hide his belief that a ruler should be guided by reason and virtue. He spoke openly about the need for leaders to act justly, showing that his teachings were not meant to keep people silent about injustice. Moreover, his emphasis on acting according to nature includes a duty to help others, not just to endure personal hardship. The influence of his teaching can be traced through later philosophers. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius wrote in his personal journal, "If you are distressed by anything external, it is not the thing itself that troubles you, but your judgment about it." This line mirrors Epictetus' famous statement, "It is not things that disturb us, but our opinions about them." The similarity shows how the later ruler took the earlier teacher's ideas and made them part of his own practice. Beyond the ancient world, the ideas have found a place in modern military training. Soldiers are taught to focus on what they can control, their own actions and discipline, while accepting the chaos of battle that lies beyond them. This training echoes the Stoic distinction between internal and external. In the business world, leaders often cite Epictetus when they talk about controlling the controllables during a crisis, such as a supply chain disruption or a market crash. One modern analogy that helps explain the concept is the story of a sailor at sea. The sailor cannot command the wind or the waves, but he can adjust his sails, steer the boat, and keep his eyes on the horizon. If a storm hits, the sailor's calm comes from knowing he has done everything within his power to prepare, and that the storm itself is beyond his control. This image captures the same lesson that Epictetus taught his students in the Stoa. Another analogy uses a garden. A gardener plants seeds, waters them, and removes weeds. The gardener cannot guarantee that a frost will not damage the plants, but he can tend the soil and protect the seedlings as best as possible. When the frost arrives, the gardener accepts the loss, learns from it, and plans for the next season. This simple picture shows how focusing on effort, not outcome, leads to a steady mind. The story of Epictetus meeting with Hadrian also illustrates how a ruler can benefit from Stoic ideas. Hadrian asked the philosopher why a man should not be angry when his property is taken. Epictetus answered that property is not part of a person's true self. It is only a temporary tool. The emperor liked this answer and later tried to rule with a sense of fairness, remembering that his power was a tool, not his identity. This anecdote shows that the teacher's influence reached the highest levels of power. The death of Epictetus's master provides another lesson. When the news arrived, some people expected him to mourn as a sign of respect. Instead, he used the moment to show that grief over an external event can be a sign of misplaced attachment. He said that a wise person sees death as a natural part of life and does not let it disturb inner peace. This calm reaction helped his students see that even a big loss can be met with steadiness. Cross-reference with other thinkers of his era helps place Epictetus in the wider picture. Seneca, who also wrote about the importance of inner freedom, was a senator and advisor to Nero. Seneca's letters often discuss how to keep calm while serving a tyrant, a theme similar to Epictetus's advice to focus on what is within one's power. Musonius Rufus, as mentioned, taught that philosophy should be practiced in daily life, not just discussed in theory. This shared belief ties the group of Stoic teachers together. In addition to the Roman world, Greek philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle also explored the idea of virtue, but they placed more emphasis on the role of the community and the state. Epictetus' focus on personal judgment set him apart. He taught that each person carries the responsibility to shape their own mind, regardless of the political environment. This focus on the individual mind made his ideas attractive to later thinkers who lived in less stable societies. The modern revival of Stoicism often cites Epictetus as a guide for dealing with anxiety and uncertainty. Podcasts about Stoic habits repeat his advice to write down what is under one's control each morning and to review one's actions each night. This practice mirrors the foundations of Stoic thought sit at the heart of Epictetus' teaching. They begin with a simple idea. Life works best when a person follows nature. In the ancient world, nature meant the order that the universe follows, the way a river flows, the way a tree grows. To live in harmony with that order is to accept what is given and to act where action can make a difference. That idea appears in the earliest Stoic school founded by Zeno of Citium in the early 3rd century BCE. Zeno taught his students in a painted porch, the Stoa Poikile, on the Athenian agora. The word Stoic itself comes from that porch. One story tells how Zeno, after being shipwrecked on a Greek island, walked barefoot into the market and asked for a place to teach. A merchant offered him the empty porch. Zeno set up a simple bench and began to speak about living according to nature. The image of a teacher using a public space to share ideas became a model for later Stoic teachers, including Epictetus. Epictetus was born a slave in the Roman city of Hierapolis. He spent his early years learning the language of his master, learning the chores of the household, and listening to the conversations of the free men who passed by. When his master died, Epictetus bought his freedom with a small sum of money. He then moved to Rome, where he opened a school in a public colonnade, much like Zeno's porch. The setting mattered. A public space reminded students that philosophy was not meant for a closed elite, but for anyone who wanted to live better. The anecdote of Epictetus standing in the colonnade, his voice echoing off the marble, shows how the Stoic message was meant to be heard by all. The first basic idea of Stoicism is the division between what is up to us and what is not. The philosopher divides life into two parts. The first part includes our own thoughts, desires, and actions. The second part includes everything else: other people's opinions, the weather, the health of our body, the state of the economy. The Stoic says that only the first part belongs to us. The second part is beyond our control. This division is often called the dichotomy of control. A simple way to see it is to picture a driver before a long trip. The driver checks the fuel level, the oil, the tire pressure. Those are things the driver can change. The driver cannot control the traffic lights that will appear on the road or the weather that may turn rainy. A good driver focuses first on what can be fixed, then accepts the rest. In the same way, a Stoic focuses on thoughts and actions and accepts the rest. The second basic idea is that living according to nature means acting in a rational way. Humans have a part of them that can think clearly, compare, and choose. That rational part is what makes a person human. When a person uses that part, they act in line with the order of the world. The world, according to Stoics, follows a rational pattern called logos. The word logos can be hard, but it simply means the rule or the reason that runs through everything. By following our own reason, we line up with the larger reason of the universe. The gardener analogy helps. A gardener tends to the plants that can be watered. He does not waste time worrying about the sun's distance from Earth. He knows the soil, the seeds, the water. He works within what he can change. The gardener's success depends on his skill, not on the weather. In the same way, a person works within the sphere of personal choice. Epictetus often repeated a short saying that sums up the idea. He said, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them." The quote comes from his Discourses, recorded by his student Arrian. The meaning is clear. A lost job, a broken vase, a harsh word, none of those objects cause pain. The pain comes from the story the mind tells about the object. If the mind says, "I must have this job, otherwise I am worthless," then loss brings suffering. If the mind says, "I lost the job, but I can learn new skills," the loss is less painful. The Stoic practice is to watch those stories and to change them. Another early Stoic, Cleanthes, wrote a hymn to Zeus that praised the order of the cosmos. He said that the wise person follows the pattern of the world, just as a river follows its bed. The image of a river is common in Stoic teaching. A river cannot stop its flow, but it can choose how to navigate the rocks. The Stoic chooses how to respond to obstacles, not to try to stop the obstacles. The spread of Stoic schools in Athens shows how the ideas grew beyond a single teacher. After Zeno, his student Clanthus took over the school. Clanthus kept the public porch as a meeting place, and he added a daily lecture schedule. The next teacher, Chrysippus, turned the school into a lively debate hall. He wrote many short arguments, called spudai, that answered questions about logic, physics, and ethics. The school attracted students from all over the Mediterranean, including Roman citizens. The fact that the school survived for centuries, moving from the original porch to larger buildings, shows that the core ideas resonated with many people. Epictetus' own school in Rome was short-lived because the Emperor Domitian closed all philosophical schools in 93 CE. Epictetus then moved back to his hometown, where he taught in a small garden. The story of the garden is another anecdote that fits the Stoic image. While teaching, he would point to a plant and say, "Just as this plant needs water and sunlight, the mind needs clear thoughts and good habits." He used the garden as a living example of the need to tend only what can be tended. The basic ideas of Stoic thought have clear modern applications. One modern practice called cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, grew out of Stoic techniques. CBT asks a person to notice the thoughts that cause anxiety, to test whether those thoughts are true, and to replace them with more realistic ones. That mirrors the Stoic habit of examining judgments. A student facing a big exam might think, "If I fail, I am a failure forever." A CBT therapist would ask, "Is that true? What evidence do you have?" A Stoic would ask the same question. Is the judgment that failure equals worthlessness accurate? By changing the judgment, the student reduces anxiety. Another example is a manager handling a delayed project. The manager cannot control the supplier's shipping problems, but can control how the team responds. The manager can decide to reallocate resources, to communicate clearly, and to keep morale high. The manager's focus on what can be changed follows the Stoic principle. The manager also accepts the delay without blaming the team, because blaming does not change the fact. Some critics say Stoicism is too rigid. They argue that by telling people to accept what they cannot change, Stoicism may encourage passivity. A critic named Michel Foucault, though not a Stoic, wrote the Stoic quietism can be a tool for those in power to keep the masses calm. The argument goes like this. If a worker accepts low wages because the market is beyond my control, then the system stays unchanged. The Stoic response is that acceptance does not mean inaction. Acceptance means seeing the facts clearly, then acting where action can be effective. A Stoic would still protest against injustice if the protest can change the situation. The key is to avoid emotional overload that clouds judgment. A second counterargument claims that Stoicism ignores emotions. The critic says that emotions are not just judgments, but deep feelings that need expression. The philosopher Martha Nussbaum has written that emotions are judgments about what matters to us, but they also shape our values. The Stoic reply is that emotions arise from judgments. If the judgment is wrong, the emotion is misguided. By correcting the judgment, the emotion changes. A person who feels anger because someone insulted my honor can examine the belief that honor depends on others' opinions. If that belief is softened, the anger fades. The Stoic does not forbid feeling. The Stoic seeks to transform harmful feelings into rational responses. The Stoic idea of focusing on what can be changed also appears in everyday life. A parent dealing with a teenage child's mood swings can control the teenager's hormones, but can control how they listen, how they set clear expectations, and how they model calm behavior. By staying within the sphere of control, the parent reduces stress and creates a better environment. The parent's calm also shows the teenager a way to handle strong feelings. Later sections of the series will show practical exercises that help listeners put these ideas into daily use. One exercise asks listeners to write down 3 things that happened today, and to mark each as in my control or outside my control. The exercise is a simple way to train the mind to see the division. Another exercise invites listeners to recall a recent upset, to write the judgment behind the upset, and then to ask, is this judgment true? What evidence supports it? The practice mirrors the ancient Stoic habit of self-examination. Modern interpretations of Stoicism often link the ancient ideas to science. Researchers in psychology have measured the effect of Stoic reframing on stress levels. The studies show that people who regularly practice the dichotomy of control report lower anxiety. The practice also appears in modern leadership training. Sayers are taught to focus on their own decisions and to accept market forces they cannot change. The language may differ, but the core idea stays the same. A further modern example comes from sports. A runner training for a marathon cannot control the weather on race day, but can control the training plan, the diet, the sleep schedule. The runner uses a Stoic mindset to stay calm when a storm threatens the race. The runner accepts the storm, but still prepares the body as best as possible. The runner's calm focus improves performance. The ancient Stoics also used vivid stories to illustrate their points. One story tells of a ship captain who loses his compass in a storm. He cannot change the storm, but he can keep the crew calm, adjust the sails, and steer by the stars that are still visible. The captain's calm action keeps the ship from crashing. The story shows that even in chaos, there is room for rational action. Another story from Epictetus' own life tells how a wealthy patron once offered him a large sum of money to stop teaching. Epictetus replied that money is not his concern because it is not in his power to keep it. He said, "If you give me a gift, I will accept it as a friend, not as a teacher." The anecdote shows how the Stoic separates personal integrity from external offers. The core idea that living according to nature also means living with others in a community. The Stoics believed that humans are social animals. To act in harmony with nature is to treat others fairly, to help those in need, and to keep promises. The idea of cosmopolitanism, that every human is a citizen of the world, comes from this. Epictetus taught that life is split into 2 parts. One part belongs to each person. It is the part that can be shaped by thoughts, choices, and actions. The other part is beyond any person's reach. It includes the weather, other people's opinions, and the rise and fall of fortunes. He called the first part, "What is up to us?" and the second, "What is not up to us?" This simple split is known as the dichotomy of control. It is the core of the Stoic guide to a calm mind. A student can see the idea in a daily scene. The student studies hard for an exam. The study plan, the notes taken, the effort spent are all within the student's control. The student can decide to review a chapter, to ask a teacher for help, to rest before the test. The weather on the day of the exam, the exact questions the teacher writes, the grading style of the professor are not. If a storm makes the road slippery, the student cannot change that. The student can only decide how to react. If the storm forces a late arrival, the student can stay calm, explain the delay, and focus on the test. The outcome may change, but the inner response stays in the student's power. A parent faces a similar split when a child makes a mistake. The child may spill milk, break a toy, or say a hurtful word. The parent cannot control the child's impulse in that moment. The parent can control the tone used to answer, the patience shown, the lesson taught. If the parent chooses anger, the situation grows worse. If the parent chooses calm, the child learns a softer path. The parent's reaction is the part that belongs to the parent. The child's action belongs to the world outside the parent's direct control. Epictetus gave a short saying that sums up the split. He said, "Some things are within our control, others are not." The phrase is easy to remember. It reminds the listener that the mind can stay free even when the world moves. He also wrote, "Make the best use of what is in your power, and take the rest as it comes." The quote tells a person to work hard on the part that can be worked on, and to accept the rest without complaint. A story from Roman history shows the split in action. A Roman soldier named Marcus fought in a battle that turned into a disaster. The enemy forces outflanked the legion, and the Roman line broke. The commander ordered a retreat. Marcus saw his comrades fall, his shield shattered, his sword lost. The loss was not something Marcus could change at that moment. He could not bring back the fallen men or reverse the tide of the battle. Yet he could decide how to act in the ruin. Marcus gathered the remaining soldiers, tended to the wounded, and kept his own spirit steady. He told his men, "We cannot change the clash that has passed, but we can keep our hearts firm." The soldiers' calm helped many survive. The story shows that even a lost battle can be faced with the part that belongs to a person. A second anecdote comes from a merchant in the port city of Ostia. The merchant, Lucius, bought grain at a fair price and stored it for the summer. One winter, a sudden flood ruined the storage barns. The grain was soaked. The market price fell sharply, and the loss seemed huge. The flood was outside Lucius' control. He could not stop the river, yet he could control his response. Lucius counted the remaining dry grain, sold it at a fair price, and used the profit to help a neighbor whose home was also damaged. He told himself, "The river took what it could, but my choice to help remains." By acting within his power, Lucius kept his mind at peace and earned respect in the community. Everyday life offers many more tiny tests of the split. A commuter may be stuck in traffic. The traffic jam cannot be changed by the commuter. The commuter can, however, choose to listen to music, plan the day's tasks, or practice breathing. A shopper may find a favorite shirt sold out. The sale is out of the shopper's control. The shopper can decide to look for another shirt, to wait for a restock, or to accept the loss. In each case, the calm comes from focusing on the part that belongs to the person. The split also guides how a person deals with emotions. When a friend forgets a birthday, the forgetting is outside the person's control. The feeling of hurt is inside. The person can notice the hurt, name it, and let it pass. The person can also choose to send a gentle reminder instead of a bitter reply. The choice to respond kindly is the part that belongs to the person. By seeing the split, the person avoids blaming the friend and avoids a spiral of anger. Some critics say the line between what is up to us and what is not is fuzzy. They argue that many things labeled external actually shape inner thoughts. For example, a person's health can affect mood, sleep, and ability to think clearly. If a person is sick, the illness limits the ability to stay calm. The critic says that the illness is external, but it still changes the inner state, making the split less clear. The critic also points out that social pressures can push a person towards certain actions. A worker may feel forced to stay late because the boss threatens a bad review. The worker's choice to stay calm may be limited by fear of losing the job. The critic claims that the dichotomy may oversimplify the web of influence between outside events and inner peace. A second counterargument says that external events do affect inner peace in ways that cannot be ignored. A sudden loss of a loved one can cause grief that feels beyond control. The grieving person may try to apply the split, but the depth of sorrow may feel like an external force. The argument is that some emotions are so strong that they overwhelm the ability to choose a calm response. The critic says that the Stoic claim that only thoughts matter may ignore the real impact of trauma, loss, and physical pain. They suggest that the line between internal and external is more of a spectrum than a hard split. Epictetus answered such concerns by reminding that even the strongest feeling is a judgment. He said, "It is not the thing itself that disturbs us, but our opinion about it." The quote tells that the feeling of grief is tied to the belief that the loss is a disaster. If a person can see the loss as part of life's flow, the grief can be met with acceptance. The Stoic does not deny the pain, but it asks the person to see the pain as something that can be observed, not as a rule that must dictate all action. The response remains in the person's power. Modern thinkers have taken the split and used it in therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, teaches that thoughts shape feelings. The therapist asks a client to separate what can be changed from what cannot. The client then works on the thoughts that can be altered. This practice echoes the ancient split. In the later section on daily practices, the video will show how a simple morning check can help a viewer sort the day's tasks into up to me and not up to me. The practice will help the viewer see the split in real time. Another modern use appears in the field of sports. A runner prepares for a marathon. The training plan, the diet, the pacing are all within the runner's control. The weather on race day, the crowd noise, and the exact time of the finish are not. Coaches teach runners to focus on the training and to accept the race day conditions. By doing so, the runner reduces anxiety and improves performance. The runner's calm mind follows the same split that Epictetus taught. A simple analogy can help a viewer picture the split. Imagine a garden. The gardener can choose which seeds to plant, how often to water, and when to pull weeds. The gardener cannot control the rain, the wind, or the insects that may come. The gardener can plan for rain by using a cover, but the rain itself is still outside the gardener's power. The gardener's peace comes from caring for the plants and accepting the weather. The garden image shows how the split works in a visual way. Another analogy uses a ship at sea. The captain can set the course, adjust the sails, and decide when to turn. The captain cannot control the tide, the storm, or the currents. When a storm hits, the captain cannot stop the waves, but can steer the ship to stay safe. The captain's calm comes from focusing on steering, not on the storm itself. The ship's story mirrors the soldier's calm in battle and the merchant's calm in market crash. The split also appears in the realm of art. An artist can choose the colors, the brush strokes, the subject of a painting. The artist cannot control how the audience will react, whether a critic will praise the work, or if a gallery will accept it. The artist can decide to enjoy the act of painting, to learn from each stroke, and to stay open to feedback. The artist's inner peace stays in the act of creation, not in the later reception. This view matches Epictetus's advice to focus on effort, not on outcome. A final example comes from a student who writes an essay. The student can research, draft, edit, and ask for help. The student cannot control the professor's grading rubric, the deadline set by the school, or the professor's mood on the day of grading. The student can, however, choose to submit the best work possible and to accept the grade with equanimity. The student's calm follows the split. When the split is applied, it changes how a person sees failure. Failure can be seen as a result of external factors, not as a personal flaw. The person can ask, "Did I do everything within my power?" If the answer is yes, then the failure is not a sign of weakness. The person can then move on without self-blame. This approach reduces the fear of trying new things, because the fear of loss is softened by the knowledge that only the effort matters. Epictetus also warned against mixing the two parts. He said, "Do not claim that what is not yours belongs to you." The warning means that a person should not pretend to own things that are outside control. A politician may claim that the economy is entirely his doing, when in fact many forces shape it. The politician's claim blurs the line and leads to frustration when the economy does not follow his plan. By keeping the split clear, a person avoids false pride and false despair. The split can be a guide for leaders. A manager can set clear goals, give resources, and coach employees. The manager cannot control each employee's personal life, the market's sudden shift, or a competitor's move. The manager can decide to stay steady, to support the team, and to adjust plans when needed. The manager's calm helps the whole group stay focused. The later section on daily practices will show a short exercise for managers to list what they can change each week and what they must accept. In the ancient world, the split was not only a personal tool, but also a political one. The Roman senator Seneca, a fellow Stoic, wrote that a ruler should care for the city's safety, but should not be upset by the city's fortunes. He said, "The ruler who worries about the city's wealth loses his peace." The idea matches Epictetus' split and shows it was used in public life. Another story from antiquity tells of a farmer named Gaius who lost his vineyard to a pestilence. The pestilence was beyond his control. Gaius could not stop the insects. He chose instead to plant a new field, to share his remaining wine with neighbors, and to accept the loss with dignity. His neighbors later helped him rebuild. The farmer's calm and forward focus earned him help and respect. The tale shows the split in a rural setting. Critics may also point out that the split can be misused to avoid responsibility. If a person says, "It is not my fault," and then does nothing, the split can become an excuse. The philosopher warns that the split is not a way to ignore duty. The person must still act on what is within power. The split tells a person to act, not to sit. The narrator begins by reminding the listener that Epictetus, a former slave who taught in Rome, held a very clear view about what is truly good. For him, the only thing that can be called good is moral character. He called this virtue. In simple terms, virtue means having the right habits, the right thoughts, and the right actions. It is the part of a person that stays steady no matter what the outside world does. Epictetus often compared the inner life to a clean kitchen. A kitchen that is tidy, with clean counters and sharp knives, can be used to make a good meal. A kitchen that has fancy curtains, gold handles and bright lights may look nice, but if the counters are dirty, it cannot serve a purpose. In the same way, a person may have wealth, fame, or comfort, but if the inner self is not clean, those things do not bring real value. Another everyday picture that Epictetus used is the friend who always keeps promises. Imagine a neighbor who promises to watch a child and then forgets. The promise is broken and trust is lost. Now picture a friend who always follows through, even when it is hard. That friend is reliable, and the trust built around that reliability is a true good. Epictetus says that the reliability of a person's character is worth more than any gold coin. He writes, "It is not the things themselves that trouble us, but the judgments we make about them." In this quote, the things can be wealth, pleasure, or fame. The judgment is what decides whether they become a source of good or of trouble. To see how this idea worked in real life, the narrator tells the story of a Roman official named Gaius. Gaius was in charge of a grain warehouse. One day, a wealthy merchant offered him a large bribe to let a shipment of low-quality grain pass as fine grain. Gaius could have taken the money and kept the secret, and no one would have known. Instead, he refused the bribe and reported the merchant to the authorities. He chose honesty over the easy gain. When the story was told by the historian Dio, he noted that Gaius said, "A clean conscience is worth more than any sum of money." Gaius' decision shows how a person who values virtue will protect it even when a tempting profit is at hand. A second anecdote comes from the school of Epictetus himself. A young student named Lucius was preparing for a public exam. He saw a classmate cheat by copying answers from a hidden paper. The temptation was great, because passing the exam would bring him a good job and a respectable life. Lucius could have taken the paper and hidden his act, but he chose instead to refuse the cheat. He told the teacher that he could not use the paper and would rather study on his own. The teacher praised his honesty and later said that Lucius' reputation for integrity helped him rise to a high position in the city council. This story shows that even when a small lie could bring immediate benefit, the commitment to virtue can bring lasting reward. Epictetus also taught that virtue is not something that depends on outside events. He argued that wealth, health, and pleasure are indifference. They are not good or bad in themselves. They become good only if they are used in a way that matches a virtuous character. For example, a person can have a lot of money, but if he spends it on selfish pleasures, the money does not become good. If the same person uses the money to help a neighbor, the act becomes good because the motive is virtuous. In this view, the external things are like tools. A hammer can build a house or break a window. The tool is neutral. The hand that wields it decides its value. The narrator now turns to the section on freedom through acceptance, which was discussed earlier. There, Epictetus explained that a person is truly free when he accepts what is outside his control and focuses on what he can control, his own thoughts and actions. The claim that virtue is the only good fits perfectly with that idea. If a person accepts that wealth and pleasure are not under his full control, he can stop chasing them as if they were the ultimate goal. Instead, he can work on his character, which is fully under his control. By doing so, he experiences a deeper sense of freedom, because nothing external can shake his inner peace. Even with this clear picture, some people have argued that pleasure or wealth can also be good. One common counterargument comes from the hedonist tradition. Hedonists say that the pursuit of pleasure is the highest good. They point to the feeling of joy that comes from a good meal, a warm bath, or a beautiful song. They claim that these pleasant experiences add value to life and should be counted as good. In response, Epictetus would say that pleasure is fleeting. A pleasant feeling can disappear in an instant, and it can also be taken away by illness or loss. What remains steady is the habit of choosing what is right, even when pleasure is absent. He would argue that a life built on pleasure is like a house built on sand. It can collapse at the first storm. A second counterargument comes from the view that wealth can be a good because it allows a person to provide for family, to support the community, and to enjoy comfort. Proponents say that without money, a person cannot meet basic needs, and therefore wealth must be considered a good. Epictetus acknowledges that money can be useful, but he keeps the focus on the intention behind its use. He would say that wealth becomes a good only when it is used by a virtuous person to do good deeds. If a rich person uses his money to harm others, the wealth is not a good. In this way, wealth is still an indifferent. It can be turned toward good or toward bad, depending on the character of the user. To make these ideas clearer, the narrator offers a modern example. Imagine a software developer who earns a high salary. He could spend his money on luxury cars, expensive vacations, and fine dining. Those things feel nice, but they do not change his inner character. If the same developer decides to donate part of his salary to a charity that teaches coding to underprivileged youth, his action reflects a virtuous motive. The money itself is neutral, but the choice to help others shows the good that comes from character. Another example is a student who studies hard for a test. The test score is a result that can bring praise. If the student studies only to get a high grade, the motive is external. If the student studies to truly understand the subject and to be able to apply knowledge responsibly, the study habit becomes a part of his virtue. The narrator now returns to the clean kitchen analogy. Picture a kitchen that has a shiny marble countertop, a fancy chandelier, and a brand new oven. The room looks impressive, but if the sink is full of dirty dishes, the chef cannot cook a meal. The chef must first wash the dishes, clean the surfaces, and organize the tools. Only then can the fancy equipment be useful. In the same way, a person may have great external gifts, but if the inner mind is cluttered with anger, envy, or fear, those gifts cannot be used well. The process of cleaning the mind through self-examination, honest reflection, and practice of good habits is what Epictetus calls the work of virtue. A story from the early Christian writer Augustine illustrates this point. Augustine once described how he tried to become a great scholar, to gain fame, and to own many books. He found that despite all his achievements, he still felt empty. Later, after reading the teachings of Epictetus, he wrote, "I have learned that the only thing I truly own is my will." Augustine's words echo the Stoic claim that inner will, guided by virtue, is the only real good. This anecdote shows that even centuries later, people still see the value of Epictetus' insight. The narrator also brings up a tale from the ancient city of Athens. A wealthy merchant named Demetrius was offered a chance to cheat in a public contract that would double his profit. He thought about the risk of being caught, but also about the easy gain. In the end, he refused, because he remembered the teaching that no man is free who is not master of himself. By staying true to his principle, he kept his reputation intact, and his business grew through honest trade. This story highlights how virtue protects a person's freedom. When a person lives by inner rules, no outside force can force him to act against his nature. One more anecdote comes from the Roman poet Juvenal, who wrote about a senator who turned down a bribe to vote for a law that would harm the poor. The senator said, "I would rather be poor and honest than rich and corrupt." This line captures the Stoic belief that wealth without virtue is empty. It also shows how the choice to keep one's character intact can inspire others to follow the same path. The narrator now points out that Epictetus often used short, clear sayings to teach. One famous quote is, "No man is free who is not master of himself." This line tells the listener that true freedom comes from self-control, not from external circumstances. Another quote is, "It is not the things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them." This reminds the audience that the mind decides what is good or bad, not the outside world. By repeating these sayings, Epictetus made his ideas easy to remember and to apply in daily life. In the section on freedom through acceptance, the narrator explained that accepting what cannot be changed reduces inner turmoil. Here, the idea that virtue is the only good adds a further step. If a person accepts that wealth and pleasure are not true goods, then the desire for them loses its grip. The mind can then focus on building character. This creates a calm that matches the calm tone of the channel. The listener can picture a sailor who accepts the wind's direction. The sailor cannot change the wind, but he can adjust his sails. In the same way, a person cannot change the fact that a storm may bring loss, but he can adjust his inner sails by holding to virtue. The narrator also wants to show how this teaching can be used in everyday choices. When a person faces a temptation to lie, he can ask himself, "Is honesty part of my character?" If the answer is yes, the person will choose the honest path, even if lying would bring a quick benefit. When a person feels angry because a friend broke a promise, he can recall that the friend's action does not change his own character. He can choose to stay calm and respond with kindness, because kindness is part of his virtue. By practicing these small choices, a person builds a strong inner garden, which is the true good. A modern parallel can be drawn with the rise of social media. Many people chase likes, followers, and viral fame. These are external rewards that can feel good for a moment. Epictetus would say that chasing them is like chasing shadows. The real work is to stay true to one's values, to post honest content, and to treat others with respect. When the audience sees a creator who stays honest even when a sensational story could bring more clicks, they witness virtue in action. This shows that the ancient teaching still fits today's world. The narrator also notes that some modern philosophers have taken Epictetus' claim and expanded it. The existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre, for example, argued that people create their own values, but he also agreed that authenticity, staying true to one's own self, is essential. While Sartre did not call it virtue, the idea that inner integrity is the core of a good life echoes Epictetus. Another modern thinker, Martha Nussbaum, writes about the importance of capabilities and human flourishing. She acknowledges that external goods matter, but she also stresses that a person's character shapes how those goods are used. This shows that Epictetus' focus on character still informs current. Epictetus taught that true freedom comes from accepting what cannot be changed. He called this the dichotomy of control. Some things belong to us, such as our thoughts, our choices, and our actions. Other things belong to the world, such as weather, other people's opinions, and events outside of our power. It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them, the teacher said. When the mind learns to keep the two groups apart, it stops fighting the impossible and can focus on what it can shape. A modern traveler can see this idea in a simple way. Imagine a plane that is delayed for 3 hours. The traveler cannot speed up the engine, cannot make the crew work faster, cannot change the storm that is keeping the runway closed. If the traveler spends the time worrying, the mind will feel trapped and angry. If the traveler accepts the delay, the mind stays calm and can use the extra time to read, to stretch, or to call a friend. The acceptance does not mean the traveler gives up on reaching the destination. It only means the traveler stops fighting the part of the situation that cannot be changed. The mind then has the freedom to choose a better response. A second everyday case shows the same pattern. A friend tells a story that ends in a different conclusion than the one the listener expects. The friend's view is not something the listener can control. If the listener argues, the conversation can become a tug of war that leaves both people upset. If the listener accepts the friend's different opinion, the mind stays open and calm. The listener can still share thoughts, but does not waste energy on trying to force agreement. Acceptance creates space for respect, not surrender of one's ideas. Epictetus himself lived this lesson as a slave in the city of Rome. He was owned by a wealthy man who could decide when the slave ate, when he rested, and when he worked. The master could also decide whether the slave would be punished for a mistake. Epictetus learned early that the master's decisions were outside his own power. He chose instead to focus on his own thoughts and attitudes. He said, "Some things are up to us. Some things are not up to us." In the quiet moments of his life, he practiced seeing the world as it was, not as he wished it to be. This practice gave him a sense of inner freedom even while his body was bound. A second historical anecdote comes from a farmer in ancient Greece. The farmer's fields were hit by a severe drought, and the crops failed. The farmer could not bring rain, could not change the sun's heat. He could, however, decide how to react. He chose to accept the loss, to mourn the loss, and then to plant a different seed the next season that could survive dry soil. The farmer's acceptance did not mean he gave up on farming. It meant he used his energy where it could matter. In choosing a new crop, in sharing the story with neighbors, in learning how to store water better. The farmer's calm acceptance allowed him to act wisely, rather than to waste anger on the sky. These stories show how acceptance works as a tool for inner freedom. Acceptance is not about giving up. It is about seeing the line between what can be changed and what cannot. When the mind respects that line, it does not waste effort on a fight that will never end. The mind can then use its power where it matters most. Some people argue that acceptance can turn into passivity. They say that if one always accepts what happens, one may stop trying to improve the world. A critic might point to a tyrant who harms many people. If the victims simply accept the tyrant's rule, the tyrant stays in power. The critic says, acceptance can be a cover for inaction. This view worries that the idea of inner freedom might be used as an excuse to avoid responsibility. Another counterargument comes from activists who fight injustice. They claim that the call to accept what cannot be changed may silence protest. If a protester hears, "Accept the law that oppresses you," the protester may feel forced to stay quiet. The activist says, some things are not only beyond our control, they are wrong, and we must change them. The activist worries that the teaching of acceptance could be twisted to keep people in place. Epictetus answered a similar worry in his own life. He was a slave, but he also taught that while external events are out of our control, our response to injustice is still within us. He said, if anyone tells you that a certain thing is not yours to do, ask whether that thing is within your power to choose. In other words, one can accept the fact that a tyrant rules, but one can still choose to speak truth, to help a neighbor, or to plan a safe escape. Acceptance of the external condition does not stop a person from acting ethically inside that condition. The modern reader can see how this works in everyday life. When a city passes a law that seems unfair, a citizen can accept that the law is now in force. That acceptance does not stop the citizen from voting, from writing letters, or from joining a peaceful march. The citizen simply does not waste energy fighting the fact that the law exists. Instead, the citizen spends energy on the actions that can be taken. To keep the practice clear, Epictetus offered a simple exercise. Each evening, write down 3 events that happened during the day. For each event, ask, was this up to me or not up to me? If it was not up to you, note a short phrase such as, outside my control. If it was up to you, note a phrase such as, my choice. Then, for the events that were not up to you, write a brief line about how you accepted them. This routine trains the mind to see the line clearly. A second exercise builds on the first. In the morning, pick one situation that may happen during the day, such as a traffic jam or a disagreement at work. Imagine the worst that could happen. Then ask, is the worst outcome something I can control? If the answer is no, practice saying to yourself, I will accept what I cannot change. If the answer is yes, plan a small step you can take to improve the outcome. This mental rehearsal helps the mind stay calm when the real event arrives. These exercises are used today in many therapy methods. Cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, teaches people to separate thoughts that can be changed from facts that cannot. The therapist may ask, what part of this situation can you influence? The answer often mirrors Epictetus' dichotomy of control. By labeling the parts, the client can stop spiraling into worry and focus on concrete steps. Modern philosophers also see Epictetus' teaching as a foundation for what they call psychological resilience. They argue that people who accept the limits of what they can control tend to recover faster from stress. A study of soldiers returning from deployment found that those who practiced acceptance reported lower anxiety and higher life satisfaction. The study's authors linked the result to the ancient Stoic idea that inner freedom grows when the mind does not cling to the uncontrollable. Another modern example comes from a workplace. A manager announces a company restructuring that will move some employees to different offices. The employees cannot stop the decision. Those who accept the change find ways to make the new office comfortable, to meet new colleagues, and to keep their work quality high. Those who resist the decision spend the day arguing with the email, feeling angry, and lose focus. The acceptance group ends up more productive and less stressed. Returning to the story of the captive during a siege, the ancient historian recorded how a Roman soldier held inside a city wall watched the enemy batter the gates for weeks. The soldier could not stop the enemy's siege engines. He could not open the gates. Yet he kept his mind steady. He told his comrades, "We cannot change the siege, but we can keep our hearts calm. By accepting the siege, the soldier helped his unit avoid panic, kept morale steady, and waited for the moment when the city's defenders could break the siege. The soldier's calm acceptance turned a hopeless situation into a chance for coordinated action. The farmer's story also shows a link between acceptance and action. After the drought, the farmer accepted that the harvest was lost. He then used his saved grain to feed his family while he prepared the soil for a new crop. He also shared his experience with other farmers, teaching them how to plant drought-resistant seeds. The farmer's acceptance did not stop him from helping his community. It gave him the space to think clearly about the next steps. Both anecdotes illustrate that acceptance is a platform, not a prison. The mind first stops fighting the unchangeable, then it can see the options that remain. This is why Epictetus called acceptance freedom. Freedom is not the ability to get whatever one wants. Freedom is the ability to choose how to think and act, even when the world does not move as desired. The two counter-arguments still matter, however. The risk of passivity is real if a person mistakes acceptance for resignation. To avoid this, Epictetus added a second line. Do not think that you are free from responsibility. He urged his students to keep caring about justice, to keep caring about virtue, while still knowing what lies beyond their power. The balance is delicate, but it can be practiced. One way to keep the balance is to ask, after each acceptance, what good can I still do? If the answer is nothing, then perhaps the situation truly is beyond influence. If the answer is something, then the mind moves from acceptance to action. A final modern analogy can help. Think of a river that flows toward the sea. A rock placed in the river cannot stop the water. The water flows around it. The rock can either be angry at the water, or it can settle into the riverbed and let the water pass. The rock does not control the river, but it can control how it sits. The rock's calm position allows the water to keep moving, and the rock stays safe. If the rock tried to block the river, it would be smashed. Acceptance is like the rock's calm position. The rock does not stop the river, but it does not get broken either. In the same way, a person cannot stop a delayed flight, but can choose how to sit in the airport. A person cannot force a friend to share the same view, but can choose to listen with respect. A person cannot stop a tyrant's rule, but can choose to speak truth, to help the oppressed, or to plan a peaceful change. Acceptance clears the mind, and the clear mind can see the small actions that still matter. To bring the lesson home, the narrator can repeat the core phrase that Epictetus used. Some things are up to us, some things are not up to us. When the phrase is spoken slowly, it becomes a reminder that the mind can draw a line each day. The line is simple. If a situation is not up to you, breathe, accept, and move on. If a situation is up to you, decide what good action to take. This two-step habit builds a habit of inner freedom. The practice also fits into a larger view of life. Freedom through acceptance does not mean the gentle voice of the narrator begins by reminding the listener of the core idea that was explored earlier. In those earlier moments, the discussion focused on what is in our control and what lies outside of us. It also explained that virtue is the only true good. The present section moves from theory to practice. It shows how a person can turn the teachings of Epictetus into tiny habits that fit into a normal day. Each habit is small enough to try, yet each one points toward the larger goal of living a free and virtuous life. Morning reflection is the first habit that is suggested. When the sun rises, a person can sit for a few minutes and ask a simple question. What is within my power today, and what is not? The answer can be written on a piece of paper or simply kept in mind. The practice follows the advice of Epictetus, who said, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them." By looking at the day ahead, a person can notice that the weather, the traffic, or the mood of a colleague are not under personal control. What is under control is the choice to stay calm, to act with honesty, and to keep a steady mind. A short morning pause helps to set that intention. Journaling thoughts is the next habit. After the morning reflection, a person can take a notebook and write down any worries that arise. The writing does not need to be long. A sentence or two is enough. The purpose is to see the thoughts on the page, to separate them from the self, and to ask whether each thought is about something that can be changed. If it is not, the note can be marked as outside my control. If it is, the note can include a short plan for how to act. This practice mirrors the ancient habit of the Stoic philosopher who kept a diary of his own judgments. The act of writing makes the abstract idea of control concrete. Checking reactions to small annoyances is a habit that can be done at any moment. When a minor irritation appears, a loud car, a rude comment, a missed bus, a person can pause for a breath and ask, "Is this something I can change?" If the answer is no, the next step is to notice the feeling that rises, to name it, and then to let it go. This tiny pause follows the teaching that freedom comes from how one responds, not from the event itself. The habit can be practiced many times a day, each time building a stronger habit of calm. Two relatable examples illustrate how these habits work in everyday life. The first example shows a person who receives a rude comment on a social media post. The comment is sharp, and the first impulse is to fire back with anger. Instead, the person remembers the morning reflection practice. The person asks, "Is this comment something I can control?" The answer is no. The feeling of irritation is noted, and the person chooses to pause. A breath is taken, and the person replies with a calm, measured response, or decides not to reply at all. This small act follows the Stoic rule that the mind should stay steady no matter how others act. The second example occurs at night, just before sleep. The person looks back on the day and asks, "Did I act according to virtue?" The notebook is opened and the short notes from the day are read. If a moment of impatience is found, the person writes a brief line about how the reaction was noted and how a better response could be tried tomorrow. This nightly review is a quiet way to keep the mind aligned with the goal of virtue. It also helps the person to see progress over time, turning the abstract idea of becoming better into a series of small, visible steps. History offers stories that echo these habits. One anecdote comes from a Roman soldier who served under the empire. The soldier kept a small piece of parchment each night. He wrote a single line about what he could not control that day, a commander's order, the weather, the outcome of battle, and then added a line about what he did control, such as keeping his discipline, staying honest, and treating his comrades well. The soldier's note ended with a reminder to focus on the inner strength that cannot be taken. This nightly note helped the soldier stay calm in the chaos of war and kept his mind focused on virtue. Another anecdote tells of a teacher in a small Greek town who taught children the practice of repeating a calming phrase. The phrase was, "I am not upset by what happens, but by my thoughts about it." Each morning the teacher asked the class to say the phrase together. The children learned to link the words to a breath. When a child was angry because a game was lost, the teacher reminded the class to pause, breathe, and repeat the phrase. Over time, the children learned to step back from the heat of the moment and to see that the feeling was a choice, not a forced reaction. The teacher's simple phrase became a tool that helped the whole class develop a steadier mind. The script now turns to two common objections that people raise about short practices. The first objection says that brief habits cannot bring about deep change. Some thinkers argue that a few minutes of reflection each morning is too light to transform a person's character. They claim that true virtue requires long, intense study, and that daily habits are merely a surface layer. In response, the narrator points out that the habits are not meant to replace deep study. They are meant to keep the mind in a state that is ready for deeper work. The small habits act like a daily stretch for a muscle. Without the stretch, the muscle can become stiff and unable to grow. In the same way, a mind that does not practice calm will find it harder to engage in deep philosophical work. The second objection questions whether modern life allows enough consistency for these habits to matter. Critics note that people are busy, distracted, and often forget to pause. They say that a habit that is broken often will not build the habit of virtue. The response to this objection is that the Stoic teacher himself taught that the practice of virtue is a series of attempts, not a flawless record. Epictetus himself said, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it." The point is that even an imperfect practice is better than none. Each time a person remembers to pause, the mind is being trained. Over time, the number of pauses will increase, even if some days are missed. The narrator now links the habits back to the earlier discussion of control and virtue. The earlier part explained that only our own thoughts and actions are truly ours. The habits listed here are tools to keep that lesson alive. When a person reflects in the morning, the person is checking what belongs to the self. When the person journals, the person is separating internal judgments from external events. When the person checks reactions, the person is exercising the power to choose a response. All three habits keep the focus on the part of life that is under personal control, which is the core of Stoic freedom. Quotes from Epictetus are woven into the narration to give the voice of the ancient teacher. One quote that appears early in the segment is, "Freedom is the only worthy goal." This line reminds the listener that the aim of the habits is not simply to feel good, but to become free from the sway of things outside one's power. Another quote used later is, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you say." This short saying captures the idea that intention and action must match. The morning reflection sets the intention, and the daily practices put that intention into action. The script now offers a practical guide for a week of practice. On day 1, the person wakes up, sits for 3 breaths, and asks what is in control today. On day 2, the person adds a short journal entry after the reflection. On day 3, the person adds a quick check of a small annoyance at lunch. On day 4, the person combines the morning reflection with the evening review. On day 5, the person tries the pause before replying to a rude comment, as in the earlier example. On day 6, the person reads the soldier's nightly note and writes a similar line. On day 7, the person repeats the teacher's calming phrase at the start of the day. This step plan shows how each habit can be layered, building a routine that feels natural rather than forced. The narrator also points out that the habits can be adjusted to fit any schedule. If a person only has a minute in the morning, that minute can be used for a quick breath and a single question. What can I control now? If a person has more time, The person can expand the journal entry to include a short gratitude note. The core idea stays the same. Keep the mind focused on what can be changed, and let go of what cannot. A final story illustrates the lasting impact of the habits. A merchant in a bustling market once struggled with anger whenever a customer bargained too hard. He tried to ignore the feeling, but the anger grew and hurt his relationships. He remembered the morning reflection practice. He began each day by noting that the price of goods was not his control, but his reaction to the bargaining was. He kept a short note each night about how he handled a tough negotiation. Over weeks, he found that he could stay calm, listen better, and even close more deals because his mind was not clouded by irritation. The merchant's experience shows how the simple habits can ripple into larger parts of life. In closing, the narrator ties the whole segment back to the central theme of Epictetus' philosophy. The teachings say that a good life is built on virtue, on recognizing what belongs to the self, and on using the mind as a tool for freedom. The habits described here are tiny tools that help the mind stay sharp. They are not magic spells, but steady practices that, over time, shape a person's character. The voice ends with a gentle reminder that each day offers a chance to practice, to pause, and to choose the path of virtue. The journey is made of many small steps, and each step is an opportunity to live the philosophy of Epictetus in everyday life. Epictetus, teaching about what lies inside a person's control, has drawn sharp criticism from many corners of philosophy and everyday life. One of the most common charges is that his advice to keep emotions at a distance amounts to a kind of emotional suppression. Critics say that telling a person to view grief, anger, or love as outside the realm of true concern can lead to a cold, detached way of living. They argue that human beings are not meant to push feeling into a box, but to feel fully and to let those feelings guide actions. In this view, Epictetus' call to be indifferent to what is not yours can be read as a rule that tells people to hide their inner lives, to pretend that the storm inside them does not exist. A second frequent objection is that the Stoic focus on personal inner work ignores the duties a person has toward family, community, and the larger world. Critics point out that if every individual simply works on their own mind, the larger social fabric may fray. They claim that Epictetus' emphasis on inner freedom can be used to excuse a lack of civic engagement, a refusal to act against injustice, or a tendency to accept the status quo because it is not in our power. In this reading, the Stoic path looks like a retreat from the world rather than a way to engage it responsibly. To see how these criticisms play out in everyday life, imagine a teenager named Maya who has just received a low grade on a math test. Her parents ask why she looks so sad, and she tells them that she does not want to bother anyone with her disappointment. She recalls a line from a popular quote that says, "Don't let external events control your peace." She tries to push the feeling of sadness away, telling herself that the grade is not in her control and therefore not worth feeling upset about. In the moment, Maya's attempt to follow a Stoic-like rule feels like she is hiding a real hurt. She may later wonder whether her silence helped her heal or simply left the feeling to linger beneath the surface, unexamined. Consider another example, this time an activist named Luis, who has spent months organizing a peaceful protest against a local policy that harms the environment. Luis feels a deep sense of duty to speak out, and his heart is heavy with anger at the injustice. He reads a modern interpretation of Epictetus that says, "We cannot control the actions of the powerful, but we can control how we respond." He wonders whether that advice means he should calm his anger, perhaps even suppress it, to keep his mind clear. If he follows the Stoic suggestion too strictly, Luis might feel that his passionate drive is being muted, and he could question whether his commitment to the cause is still genuine. The tension between personal emotional honesty and the Stoic call to focus on what is within one's power becomes a real dilemma for him. These two stories illustrate why many people feel that Epictetus's ideas can seem to ask for an unrealistic emotional restraint. Yet the criticisms often miss a subtle point in the original teaching. Epictetus never said that feelings should be erased. He taught that judgments about events, not the events themselves, are the source of disturbance. In his own words, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them." The teenager's sadness, then, is not the problem. The belief that the sadness is a sign of weakness is what needs attention. Similarly, the activist's anger is not the problem. The belief that anger must always be expressed outwardly, even when it clouds judgment, is what the Stoic invites to be examined. A historical anecdote helps to show how these ideas were debated in the ancient world. In the 2nd century BCE, a public debate took place in the Lyceum Garden of Athens between Stoic philosophers and Epicurean thinkers. The Epicureans, who taught that pleasure and the avoidance of pain are the highest goods, argued that the Stoics' call to indifference to external things would leave a person barren of joy. A Stoic named Musonius Rufus responded by saying that true joy comes from living in accordance with nature, and that the indifference spoken of by Epictetus does not mean a lack of feeling, but a freedom from being ruled by those feelings. The debate continued for hours, with each side quoting earlier masters. The Epicurean leader, Philodemus, warned that a person who treats all external events as irrelevant may become apathetic, while Musonius reminded the audience that the wise man is not indifferent to everything. He is indifferent to the wrong use of things. This ancient exchange shows that the charge of emotional suppression was already being raised in Epictetus' own time, and that Stoics had a ready reply. Another colourful anecdote comes from the Roman poet Juvenal, who wrote a satirical poem that mocked the Stoics' calm demeanour. In one passage, Juvenal describes a man who, when a fire breaks out in his house, stands as still as a statue, his eyes fixed on the flames, as if the blaze were a painting on a wall. He then adds, "The Stoic's heart beats not for the loss of his home, but for the next breath of the wind." Juvenal's sharp humour points to a perception that Stoics could be absurdly detached, even in the face of disaster. The poet's exaggeration was meant to provoke laughter, but it also captured a genuine concern that the Stoic ideal might be taken to an extreme where compassion and urgency disappear. Modern scholars have offered two main counter-arguments to these criticisms. The first defense focuses on Epictetus' insistence on personal responsibility. He taught that each person owns the power to shape their own mind, and that this inner work is not an escape from the world, but a way to act in it with clarity. By training the mind to see what is truly within control, a person can avoid being swayed by fear or anger, and can therefore act more wisely in social situations. For example, a citizen who has examined his own judgments about a law will be better able to decide whether to protest, to negotiate, or to accept a compromise. The inner discipline becomes a tool for effective action, not a reason to stay silent. The second defense points to the long line of thinkers who built on Epictetus' ideas, showing that his influence has not led to a cold, detached culture, but to movements that value both inner strength and social commitment. The early Christian writer Augustine, the medieval mystic Thomas Aquinas, and the modern philosopher Martha Nussbaum each drew from Stoic concepts while emphasizing love, justice, and empathy. In the 20th century, the civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. quoted Epictetus in a speech, noting that the greatest weapon of oppression is the belief that one cannot change what is within one's own power. King's use of the Stoic idea shows that personal responsibility can fuel collective action. By linking Epictetus to these later figures, the defense argues that the philosopher's teachings have been a source of moral courage, not a license for emotional numbness. When the video moves to the legacy section, it will be useful to remind viewers that the Stoic practice of examining one's judgments has been woven into modern cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. Therapists often ask patients to identify the thoughts that cause distress and to test whether those thoughts are accurate. This technique mirrors Epictetus's advice to check whether a judgment is true before allowing it to disturb the mind. In that sense, the criticism that Stoicism suppresses feeling is answered by the fact that modern psychology uses the same method to help people feel better, not to make them feel less. To bring the discussion back to everyday life, consider a third scenario that blends the two earlier examples. A college student named Sam is studying for a final exam while also caring for a sick parent. Sam feels torn between the duty to study and the duty to stay at the bedside. A friend suggests that Sam follow Epictetus' rule and focus only on what can be controlled: the amount of time spent on study and the quality of visits with the parent. Sam worries that this approach might make him ignore the deeper feeling of guilt that comes from not being able to do more. By reflecting on Epictetus' teaching, Sam learns that the guilt itself is a judgment about his own performance, not an inevitable fact. He can choose to see the guilt as a signal, not as a command, and then act in the ways he can. In this way, the Stoic method helps Sam balance personal responsibility with social duty, rather than forcing him to hide either feeling. A fourth story shows how an activist might use the Stoic idea without losing passion. Maya, the teenager from earlier, later becomes a volunteer at a community center. She encounters a child who is upset because a playground was closed for repairs. Maya feels a surge of sadness and anger. Remembering Epictetus, she notes that the closure is outside her immediate control, but her response, offering a game, listening, and helping the child find another place to play, is within her power. By separating the event from her judgment, Maya can act compassionately without being overwhelmed. This illustrates that the Stoic approach can coexist with genuine empathy. The criticism that Stoicism neglects social duty also appears in the writings of the Roman statesman Cicero, who was a contemporary of the later Stoics. Cicero wrote that a good citizen must care about the common good, and that the welfare of the city is the highest aim of a man. He warned that a philosophy that teaches indifference to external events could make people indifferent to the needs of their neighbors. The Stoic reply, found in the letters of Seneca, argues that caring for others is not a conflict with inner freedom. Seneca wrote, "We are all made for each other, and a life lived in isolation is a life half-lived." By emphasizing that the Stoics' indifference is a technical term meaning not ruled by, rather than not caring about, the reply seeks to dissolve the apparent conflict. A modern example of this tension can be seen in the debate over climate activism. Some critics claim that a Stoic would simply accept the climate crisis as outside personal control and thus avoid protest. Others point out that the Stoic principle of acting according to reason leads a rational person to recognize that collective action can change the conditions that affect many lives. The activist who feels a duty to protest can still hold a Stoic view by recognizing that while the large system is not fully under personal control, the choice to speak out, to educate, and to vote is. In this way, the Stoic framework can support activism rather than undermine it. To further illustrate the point, a quote from Epictetus's Discourses can be offered. "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." This line is often misunderstood as a call to ignore how others see you. In context, it means that a person should not let fear of judgment stop them from doing what they believe is right. The activist who protests despite being called troublemaker follows this advice. He does not let the opinion of the powerful dictate his inner judgment. The quote thus becomes a tool for moral courage, not a reason to suppress feeling. Another primary source, quote, helps to clarify the idea of emotional control. Epictetus said, "It is not the events themselves that trouble us, but the opinions we form about them." By focusing on the opinion, the philosopher invites a person to examine the story they tell themselves. If a teenager tells herself, "I am a failure because I got a bad grade," that opinion creates distress. If she revises the story to, "I did not do well this time, but I can study and improve," the distress lessens. The practice is not about denying the feeling of disappointment, but about changing the narrative that fuels it. The debate between Stoics and Epicureans, mentioned earlier, also provides a useful contrast. Epicureans argued that pleasure, understood as the absence of pain, is the end goal. They believe that cultivating friendships and simple joys leads to a good life. Stoics, on the other hand, claimed that virtue, living in agreement with reason, is the highest good, and that external pleasures are not necessary for happiness. The Epicurean critique of Stoic indifference was that it could lead to a life devoid of joy. The Stoic reply was that true joy comes from inner stability, not from fleeting external comforts. This ancient dialogue shows that the question of whether Stoicism suppresses feeling has been part of its story from the start. The Roman poet Horace, a contemporary of the later Stoics, wrote a line that can be read as a gentle poke at the Stoic. Epictetus taught that the mind can stay calm no matter what happens outside. That idea has traveled across centuries and now shows up in many places. In self-help books, a reader will often find a short rule that says, "You cannot control events, only your response." That line is almost a direct echo of the old master's claim that men are disturbed not by things, but by the view they take of them. The phrase appears in modern guides on stress, on productivity, and on happiness. The voice of Epictetus is quiet, but it is loud enough to be heard in the pages of popular titles that sit on coffee tables today. One way the teaching shows up is in therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, grew out of a belief that thoughts shape feelings. A therapist may ask a client to write down a troubling thought, then ask, "Is this thought a fact or an opinion?" That simple question mirrors the Stoic practice of examining judgments. The founder of CBT, Aaron Beck, often mentioned the ancient school as an early model. He said that the method of checking thoughts is like a mental cleaning. In that sense, the old slave teacher's lessons have become a tool for modern mental health. Leadership training also borrows from the same source. Many executive coaches hand out a one-page sheet that reads, "Focus on what you can control, let go of the rest." The sheet is used in meetings, in retreats, and in daily briefings. The coach explains that the sheet works like a playbook for calm decision-making. When a manager faces a sudden market drop, the rule reminds them to keep their actions steady, just as Epictetus advised a soldier to keep his mind steady in the heat of battle. The rule sheet is a modern version of the ancient scroll that once hung in a Roman school. A simple analogy can help picture the influence. Imagine a sports coach who gives each player a rule card that says, "Run the play you have practiced, ignore the crowd." The player does not think about the noise. He just follows the plan. In the same way, a modern self-help author gives readers a rule that says, "Notice the thought, then let it pass." The rule acts like a card that keeps the mind focused on the practice, not on the distraction. The coach's card and the author's rule both trace back to the same ancient idea of separating what can be changed from what cannot. Another everyday picture comes from a parent watching a child at a soccer game. The child is upset because the other team scored. The parent says, "Take a deep breath, think about what you can do next, and keep playing." The parent is teaching the child to stay calm by focusing on the next move, not on the loss. That moment mirrors Epictetus' lesson that a person should keep inner peace by directing attention to the present action. The parent's calm voice becomes a living example of the old teacher's advice. The journey of these ideas did not happen all at once. During the Renaissance, scholars began to dig up old manuscripts and bring them back to life. One scholar, Pietro Francesco, found a copy of the Discourses in a dusty library in Venice. He translated the work into Latin, and the translations spread through the universities of Italy and France. A famous poet, Michel de Montesquieu, wrote in a letter that the Stoic sayings gave him a steady hand in the storms of court life. The revival gave the ancient thoughts a new audience, and the ideas began to mix with humanist thought. The Renaissance revival showed that the old lessons could speak to new times, just as modern readers find them useful today. A second historical turning point came in the 20th century. A psychologist named Albert Ellis created a therapy called rational emotive behavior therapy, or REBEAT. Ellis often quoted Epictetus, saying that the great power of the Stoics is that they taught us to change our thinking, not the world. Ellis built a system that asked people to spot irrational beliefs, then replace them with rational ones. The system was simple enough to be taught in a classroom and strong enough to help people with anxiety and depression. The link between Ellis' method and the old slave teacher's practice is clear. Both focus on the mind's role in shaping experience. Even in the world of business, the influence is evident. A well-known management book from the 1990s includes a chapter titled "Control What You Can." The author cites a line from Epictetus that reads, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our opinions about them." The chapter tells readers to list the things they can act on, then to let go of the rest. The exercise is a modern version of the ancient practice of preparing the mind before a challenge. The book's success shows how the old teaching fits neatly into the modern desire for clear, actionable steps. The modern spread of Epictetus' ideas is not without criticism. One common counter-argument says that the popular versions strip away the deeper moral side of Stoicism. The ancient teacher linked calm mind to a life of virtue, to acting with justice and kindness. When a self-help guide only offers a rule for staying calm, it may miss the part that says a calm mind should also do good. Critics point out that without the ethical backbone, the advice can become a selfish tool for personal gain. A second counter-argument focuses on the risk of turning a complex philosophy into a quick fix. Some modern programs promise that a single rule will end stress forever. The original teachings, however, required daily practice, long reflection, and a community of learners. The ancient texts warn that true freedom comes from long work on the self, not from a one-time reading. When a program sells a 5-minute calm hack, it may ignore the patience that Epictetus asked his students to develop. These critiques do not erase the value that many people find in the modern forms. The earlier part of the video showed simple exercises like the morning check and the evening review. Those practices echo the ancient habit of examining one's thoughts each day. The present section links back by showing that the same habit now appears in therapy worksheets, in leadership handouts, and in popular books. The continuity helps viewers see that the old exercises are still alive, just dressed in new language. A real-world example can be seen in a corporate wellness program at a tech company. Employees receive a weekly email that says, "Ask yourself, what is in my control this week? Write one action you will take." The email ends with a short quote from Epictetus. "No man is free who is not master of himself." The staff reports lower stress levels and higher focus. The program uses the ancient idea as a simple prompt, turning philosophy into a daily habit. Another example appears in a school that teaches social, emotional learning. Teachers give students a thought card that says, "Notice the thought, then ask, is this true?" The card is used during recess when arguments arise. The students learn to pause, check their thoughts, and respond calmly. The practice mirrors the ancient training that asked slaves to watch their judgments before they acted. The school's success story shows how the old lesson can help children grow into steady adults. The modern influence also spreads through podcasts and online videos. A popular channel on personal growth often begins an episode with the line, "Remember what Epictetus taught. You cannot control the wind, but you can set your sail." The host then gives a short story about a commuter stuck in traffic who decides to listen to an audiobook instead of stewing. The story illustrates the same principle that the ancient teacher used when he told his students to focus on inner freedom, not on external events. Even the world of sports uses the idea. A famous basketball coach once told his team, "You cannot change the referee's call, but you can control your effort." The coach quoted Epictetus in a locker room talk, reminding players that the only thing they own is their response. The team went on to win the championship, and the coach credited the Stoic mindset for keeping the players calm under pressure. The anecdote shows how a 1,000-year-old teaching can still shape modern competition. The link between the ancient and the modern is also visible in the language of modern philosophers. A contemporary thinker, Massimo Pigliucci, writes books that blend science and Stoic practice. He often repeats the old line, "It is not the things themselves that trouble us, but the judgments we make." Pigliucci's work tries to keep the ethical depth while offering clear steps for daily life. His books serve as a bridge, showing that the old ideas can be both deep and practical. In the field of psychotherapy, a therapist named Marsha Linehan created dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT. While DBT draws from many sources, it also uses the Stoic habit of observing thoughts without judgment. Linehan has spoken about how the ancient practice helped her shape a skill called wise mind, a balanced state between emotion and reason. The skill teaches clients to notice a feeling, name it, and then decide on a calm response. The method echoes the ancient advice to keep your mind free from passion, while still engaging with life. The modern world also sees the influence in everyday language. Phrases like "let it go" and "keep your cool" have roots in the same idea that Epictetus taught. When a friend tells another, "Don't worry about the traffic, just enjoy the music," the friend is using a modern version of the old rule. The phrase spreads without people knowing the ancient source, yet the core idea remains the same. Some scholars argue that the spread of the ideas is a sign of their timeless relevance. They point out that the human mind still faces the same problem of reacting to events it cannot change. The ancient teacher offered a method that does not deny emotion, but offers a way to keep it in check. The modern adaptations keep that core, even if they simplify the language. Others warn that the simplification can lead to a shallow understanding. They note that the ancient texts also warned against using reason to justify selfish actions. The Stoic ethic says that a calm mind should serve the common good, not just personal comfort. When a self-help book focuses only on personal gain, it may miss this communal aspect. The critique reminds readers to look beyond the surface and ask how the calm mind can help others. The section returns to the practical exercises mentioned earlier. The morning check asked viewers to ask, "What will I face today, and what can I control?" The modern version appears in a corporate email, a therapist worksheet, and a parent's bedtime talk. The continuity shows that the same simple question can fit many settings. The exercise also ties back to the earlier critique, reminding viewers that the question is not just a mental trick, but a step toward a life of purpose. In sum, the teachings of Epictetus have traveled from a Roman slave's lecture hall to modern books, therapy rooms, boardrooms, and playgrounds. The ideas appear as a rule sheet for a coach, a calming phrase from a parent, a therapy prompt, and a leadership mantra. Historical moments like the Renaissance revival and the rise of cognitive therapy show how the ancient wisdom was rediscovered and reshaped. At the same time, modern adaptations sometimes cut away the deeper ethical side. And sometimes they promise quick fixes that the original teacher would not have approved. The balance between keeping the core and adding new tools is an ongoing conversation. The story of Epictetus' influence reminds viewers that a simple idea can live for 2,000 years. It also shows that each new generation can take the idea, test it, and shape it to fit its own world. The calm, steady voice of the old teacher still whispers, "Focus on what you can control." Whether that voice is heard in a therapist's office, a leader's handbook, or a child's bedtime story, the message remains a guide for a steady mind in a changing world.